All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Bees in Your Backyard webinar. So we actually had some trouble recording our webinar for Saturday, June the 13th, but Rebekah was kind enough to come back, and so we're going to go ahead and re-record and cover the same topics. We won't, unfortunately, have a Q&A involved in this webinar, but in the description of this YouTube video, you'll see some contact information. Feel free just to reach on out to Rebekah or myself, and we're happy to answer any questions that way for you. Also in that YouTube description, you'll find a link to some additional resources that Rebekah has put together about some different bees that you might find in your local area, as well as some community science campaigns that you can get involved with. And lastly, in that YouTube description, you will actually see a survey to help kind of give us some feedback on these presentations. They're a huge help to us in developing our webinar series. So if you wouldn't mind taking, about 3 to 5 minutes to give us some feedback, it's really an important step for us. So just to go over the format of this webinar, I'm gonna go through a brief description of a brief introduction of the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, who I work for. My name is Andrew.Felton, in case I missed that at the top. And then Rebekah will have Rebekah will go through her presentation, and then we'll wrap up for the morning. So before we get started, I do want to give a big thank you out to Bee and Bloom, who Rebekah works for. We typically work with Bee and Bloom in the spring and summer months to put on workshops. This year with the COVID-19 situation, we've switched those to be a webinar series. And so far it's been working really great, other than a few hiccups along the way. We always look forward to working with Bee and Bloom to put on these pollinator workshops. Now, a little bit about the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. So our district was formed in 1955. We're one of 45 soil and water conservation districts in the state of Oregon. Our service area is Washington County, which is just west of the Portland metropolitan area. Now, our district is non-regulatory, so we don't have any mandates, we don't assess any fines, but we typically work with communities and try to recommend enhancements of, we try to recommend conservation actions to be put in place to help the environment and become a more sustainable community. Now we do that through 3 different ways. The first way we help is through technical assistance. So that typically takes the form of site visits. We'll actually head out to a location and provide some insights and some advice. We also will connect folks to resources so that you might be able to implement some of those conservation actions. The second way that we promote conservation is through financial assistance. That's typically through grants or through direct financial assistance, which is a cost share program for private residents that have qualifying conservation projects that they'd like to implement. And lastly, we do that through education programs. And that's through developing community outreach materials, going to community events, and holding workshops and webinars such as these. Now, a little history of soil water conservation districts in general. So SWCDs were formed following the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. In the years leading up to the 30s, deep plowing was a common farm practice. And so what deep plowing is, it's as farmers go through and they plow their soil to great depths. Now what that did was that upended the deep-rooted grasses that were throughout the plain states. As the 30s came along and droughts and severe winds took place, all of that soil was unanchored, and so it took to the skies and formed these severe dust clouds that inundated the plain states. In total, about 100 million acres were affected by these dust clouds. Now, as this was happening in 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was formed. That agency was tasked with making recommendations for these farmers so that they could have more sustainable and conservation practices in place. Now, SWCDs are a direct ancestor of that Soil Conservation Service. Today, you'll find them throughout the nation. Typically, just about every state will have an SWCD. Sometimes they go by different names, whether that's a conservation district, a resource conservation district, but many of the principles do remain the same. And here are what those principles look like. So one of the first principles of SWCDs is that conservation should be led by local residents. These organizations are not led by the federal government, but rather they're locally sprouted. So they really work on a county-wide level. Secondly, the responsibility for conservation lies with residents. This goes back to that non-regulatory aspect that I had mentioned earlier. We don't have fines. We don't mandate that people implement conservation on their properties, but rather we offer the resources and we offer encouragement and we try to make it easier for them to do so. And finally, SWCDs are responsible to the entire community. Now, we like to say that we work on a watershed level, which means that we take a look at resource concerns that affect the entire watershed, not just in one particular practice or one particular land use. This slide here has a map of what our service area looks like. The map itself, you can see the dotted line is going to be the boundaries of Washington County. And then the map depicts some of the different land uses that occur within our Tualatin River watershed. Now, our district is unique in that we only serve one watershed typically. So if you look at that map, you can see that the Washington County area and the Tualatin River watershed are just about the same. Many SWCs don't have that, and they service multiple watersheds throughout their service area. Now, as you look closer at the map of the watershed, you can see that we have a variety of land uses throughout our region. Typically, about 50% of that Tualatin River watershed is taken up by forest lands. About 35% is more rural or agricultural lands, and then 15% is more urbanized areas. And that urbanized area is expanding every day as the Portland area quickly grows. Now, each one of those land uses has different resource concerns that are associated with it. And because of that, our district tries to address all of them. So we have a multitude of different programs with the Tualatin SWCD, from a rural program, a forestry program, urban program, a program that's specifically targeted invasive weeds, and then a habitat program that more focuses on streamside restoration habitats. Now, here's another illustration of what our service area and what our watershed looks like. The Tualatin River watershed only has a single river that flows through it. That's going to be the Tualatin River. Now, the Tualatin River flows out of the coastal range in the west. To the north, we're bordered by the Tualatin Mountains to the north and to the east. And then to the south, we're bordered by the Chilean Mountains. Now, that creates a bowl or a basin that the Tualatin River flows through. So as it's flowing from west to east, the Tualatin River drains about 900 miles of tributary streams and creeks. Here in Washington County, we receive about, give or take, about 40 inches of precipitation each year. Now, when you consider how much land that waterfall, that precipitation falls upon, it's a lot of impacts on our waterways, and that's why our district really tries to tackle each one of those resource concerns that come with different land uses. Eventually, the Tualatin River will flow into the Willamette River, which then flows up to the Columbia River, and that continues on out to the Pacific Ocean. Now, in nature, the saying goes that everything is connected, and this system shows that. No matter where resource concern lies within within our service area, it impacts the watershed at its whole. So we really want to make sure to be able to improve the health of our watershed. Now the question is, how do bees fit into this watershed system? Bees are pollinators, and pollinators are incredibly important to watershed health because they help plants grow. I read a study recently that plants that produce food are responsible for 1 in every 3 bites of food that we eat, and pollinators are directly responsible for that because they help these fruits and these vegetables grow. Likewise, pollinators help native plants grow, and native plants are one of the key components to a healthy watershed because they are adapted to our climate. Because they're adapted to our climate, they provide a variety of benefits to watershed health. Native plants' root systems are more far-reaching than invasive plants, so they typically hold onto soil better. And this will result in less erosion happening, which only will improve our water quality throughout the watershed. Likewise, native plants provide habitat for wildlife. The more wildlife that you have in a watershed, the healthier it's going to be because it's going to be a very expansive ecosystem. And lastly, because native plants are adapted to our climate, they also don't need as many pesticides or fertilizers, which have a tendency to get into our waterways and end up as pollutants. Now, native plants couldn't do all of that without pollinators. And we can't protect our watershed unless we know a little bit about these pollinators that are here. And we can't protect them unless we learn a little bit more about them. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rebekah, and we'll take a look at some of the different bees that you can find in your backyard.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for that great introduction, Andrew. My name is Rebekah, and I'm with Bee in Bloom. I'm 1/3 of Bee in Bloom. And today we're going to be talking about enjoying nature, and particularly bees and other pollinators that you might have in your backyard and in urban and suburban areas. First, I'd like to kind of start by talking about my journey to becoming a beak. And step 1 is that you have to seize every opportunity to make a bee pun. But originally, my goal was to actually be a primatologist and to study primatology. And so I went to the University of Arizona and I studied ecology and evolutionary biology. And that was originally with the goal to follow a track to, getting a graduate degree and then going to Africa to live with chimps and work in field studies and behavioral studies that way. And so in the process, during my undergrad, I took an animal behavior course with Dan Papage and had the opportunity to work as a research assistant in his lab. And we were studying bumblebee behavior and specifically how bumblebees react to different floral cues that they're putting out. So the plant itself is communicating something to the bee via flowers. So flowers are kind of this beacon that attract the bees or other pollinating insects to come and provide that pollination service that Andrew was mentioning earlier. And I'm not going to dive too much into the studies, but these are just some bullet points of the findings that we had, and the flowers that we were working with are here. You may notice that these are robotic flowers, but we were really focusing on the size and color and scent. And that way we were able to eliminate all other variables in determining how the bees were reacting to them. Okay, if anyone's interested in diving a little bit deeper, reading some of the articles that I was part of, they're all linked out here in this presentation. But post finishing my bachelor's, I moved to Portland and met some kindred spirits. So Emma here and Emily, they are my fellow partners with Bee in Bloom, and together we founded a business and our essential goal is to bring people and pollinators together and to foster those positive relationships between people and pollinators. We do keep honeybees and manage a bee sanctuary out of a farm on Sauvie Island called Willow Bar Farm. And there we invite guests and host people in experience-based education. And so we do have some where people can come open honeybee hives. We work with a lot of hobbyists and backyard beekeepers, but really our primary directive is to get people connected with native bees and native pollinators. And that's kind of what we'll be focusing on today as well. All right, so we'll kind of talk about that cast of neighborhood characters or the critters that you'll see in your backyard and in your neighborhood. And these are a few of the ones that we come in contact with quite a bit at Willow Bar Farm. So you might notice that there is a huge range of diversity, of great diversity and range of colors, shapes, sizes. And on top of that, they have a lot of different social behaviors and different characteristics that make each species incredibly important as like a piece of the pollination puzzle and a piece of the ecosystem that they represent. Okay. And throughout today's presentation, you'll hear me refer to bees as native bees or non-native bees. And what I mean by that is that there are certain species that are indigenous to a particular ecosystem. So they're really adapted to a microclimate or a specific region. More than 90% of the native bees that we have here in North America are solitary. And so you may associate division of labor and queens and large colonies as a trait that bees have, but really it's just a handful of species that do. The characteristics that make a bee or what group them all together is their phylogeny and then their diet. So phylogeny, they're in the order Hymenoptera. They're really closely related to wasps and ants, and they share many genetics in that way. And then their behavior and their food is that they consume all of their food from flowers. And so they nectar feed to gather their carbohydrate source or their sugars, and they gather pollen as their protein source. And so they are able to get all of the amino acid compounds, proteins, lipids from the pollen that the plant is producing. And so as a result, they've developed hairs on their bodies and many morphological characteristics like scopa that allow them to grab onto pollen as they're visiting the plant and then bring it back to their nest to feed their young. Most of them are very non-defensive. All female bees do have stingers, but they're very slow to use them or to react with them. Most are really small and will not act defensively toward a larger predator. Okay. And so I just wanted to mention honeybees really quickly. So honeybees are probably the most popular, most widely known about bee. There's only one species, and that's Apis mellifera. We have about 4,000 unique species in North America, and just this one is the sole producer of honey and beeswax that we have here. And they're not actually native. So they were introduced to North America in the 1600s as producers of honey and beeswax with European settlers. They now have kind of been co-opted and are widely managed as pollinators for crops. So before their introduction, our food and our food systems were widely pollinated by native bees. And that was possible because we had smaller farm plots, smaller farms that had crop rotations, that didn't grow just one type of food and that didn't have monoculture. And bees and native pollinators could live in those regions of those farms. And so they were able just to have natural and open pollination to produce the food. But now our crop fields and our agricultural system is so large, and it's like largely a monoculture. So it's just one type of food producing plant that is grown in a huge field. And all of the habitat that used to be there for native bees is no longer available for them. And so we actually require that honeybees in their large colonies be trucked in from around the world in order to have these huge pollination events to produce most of our food. And that is responsible for 1 in 3 bites of food, and that statistic that Andrew mentioned earlier today at the top. And so honeybees are really the most sophisticated eusocial bees that we have here in North America. They live in large or organized colonies with thousands and thousands of individuals and one reproductive member, one reproductive female. I'll also mention that honeybees are the only bees that die after stinging. They have a little hook or a barb at the end of their stinger that rips the venom sac out of their body, which is fatal to that honeybee. But they're the only ones that have that. All other bee species, all female bees do have stingers, but they're not barbed, and the venom that they produce isn't specifically geared toward mammalian pests the way that honeybees are. And so even if you do manage to get stung by a solitary or native bee, it's going to be less irritating than a mosquito bite, which is, not so scary. Okay, so that doesn't mean that all other bee species that you'll see here are native. There are many solitary or small colony dwelling bees that we have here that were introduced over the barrier that is the Rockies. So traditionally bees have been separated by the Rocky Mountains. And so we had Western species and Eastern species. But as humans, we've moved things around quite effectively. We know how to do that. And so we've introduced a whole range of different bees to this area. At this point, they are pretty naturalized and may make up an important portion of pollination. But it's really the native bees that we're focusing on. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different groups of bees and different groups of bees that you'll see here. And we'll start with bumblebees. So second to the honeybee, they probably are the most popularly known about. Bumblebees are the only group of native bees in North America that have social behaviors and live in colonies where you have worker bees, sterile females that take care of all of the non-reproductive tasks of the colony. So you have one queen who's laying all of the eggs, and then the worker bees who are feeding and caring for the young and doing all of the foraging jobs in the hive. Okay. And so these are some of the most common bumblebees we have in the Pacific Northwest. Here in the top corner, we have a yellow-faced bumblebee. They are definitely the most widely seen in the Portland metro area. California bumblebee, brown-belted, white-shouldered. Fuzzy-horned is one of my favorites to come across. That is Bombus mixtus, and they have very teddy bear-like mottled hair. And then here we have a black-tailed bumblebee. So you may see some bumblebees that have that kind of rusty band, that orange band across their abdomens. But this is a really nice image shot where you can actually see the black tip of her abdomen here. That little stripe gives her away as being Bombus melanopygus, which is that black-tailed bumblebee. And identifying bumblebees and other bees can be really difficult to do to the species level. I will communicate many common ones that you can see, and then you'll start being able to identify them as you're experiencing or doing your field watches. But it is very difficult to get a species identification of something that's a little bit less common. And that's something that we've become comfortable with as beaks, as bee enthusiasts, and I hope that we can pass that along to you as well. But there are some tools that you can use to help you in identifying. And one of those is this U.S. Forest Service and Pollinator Partnership Bumblebee Guide to Bumblebees of the Western United States. And this is linked out. Here are just a couple pages or a couple of shots out of that guide. And one of the most important tools that bee biologists or taxonomists use in identifying bees down to the species level is the size of their cheek. And so you might have a very short cheek a medium cheek, or long cheek. And really the only way to measure that is to catch your specimen, pin it and preserve it, and then get them underneath a dissecting scope. And so these practices are not very practical for most hobbyists or people who are just bee enthusiasts out in the field and doing site identifications. And here's another example of why it might be so difficult just to site identify. So this particular specimen, or this guide, is for Bombus balteatus. And you can tell that the queens have many different color morphs and different striping patterns. Worker bees, it's the same. And then you have the male. And so you may see a male and a female worker bee of the same species that have very different appearances. So all of those things together can make it very difficult to do site identifications in the field. Okay. If you're interested in participating in doing field studies of bumblebees and to report sightings, Bumblebee Watch is a really great citizen science project. And that's just bumblebeewatch.org. And essentially what you'll do is take a photo of a bumblebee. That can be as simple as using your phone. I believe they have an app as well. But then you'll log into your account. So you'll need to create an account with Bumblebee Watch. And then it'll put you through a series of questions that help you identify your species as much as you can just from the image. And then that will move the photo and the identification along in the process, where it'll be verified by an expert and by a bee biologist or taxonomist. The power of using photography to ID isn't always ironclad, as you might imagine, because they're not able to get them under that dissecting scope. We're not always sure if it's a different morph of one species, but it really does help them at least narrow down the possibilities of what you saw and what there are in different places. So all of these photos and all of these sightings are geotagged, and they are in the process of making a big map of bumblebees in the country, which is very cool. And that should help with tracking populations year to year, and it should also help with putting through legislation that conserves or protects particularly threatened bee species. So just in the last couple of years, some bees were added to the endangered species list, including the rusty patch bumblebee and some yellow-faced bees that are from Hawaii, native to Hawaii. And that really helps with moving legislation forward and doing education in local communities that help protect those bees that are endangered and threatened. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to talking about solitary bees. It'll be mostly about solitary bees for the rest of this presentation. As I mentioned earlier, they make up about 90% of the native bee species that we have here in North America. And most of those solitary bees will nest in the ground. And so they'll find nice, soft, non-compact earth. Sometimes they require different mineral components in order to thrive in those environments. But generally, it needs to be somewhere with low traffic that has ample drainage and lots of sunlight. And so the same kind of general method of reproduction or nesting for these bees is that they'll dig a hole down into the ground and then have these little chambers that come off to the side. The female or the mother solitary bee will go out and gather pollen. Like this mining bee, you can see her scopa, or her pollen collecting hairs on her back legs, are covered in pollen. She'll go into the tunnel, into one of those little chambers, groom the pollen off into a little sticky ball with some nectar. She'll lay an egg on it. And when that egg hatches, it'll eat all of the food in that little pollen provision that was left by its mother. It'll grow into a big fat grub in their larval stage. And then it'll spin a cocoon and pupate. And it's kind of during this phase, so the adults and the females that are doing this work are only active for about 4 to 6 weeks. And so when they are done, the rest of the year is dominated just by the little larvae, the developing bees and the brood that are underground. And then once they're done developing, they'll hibernate through the winter while there are no blooms and when there's no food in the environment. And then they'll be able to come out again in the spring or in the summer whenever their mother bee was active. Different bees have different active times, even during the warm season, since they have such short active windows of just about 4 to 6 weeks. And usually what triggers them to come out is some kind of temperature change. Temperature or a temporal change, like they've been hibernating for a certain amount of time, so okay, it's time to come out whether or not it's warm enough. Okay. Some of the common solitary ground nesting bees that you may see include, I'm going to start with longhorn bees, and I still haven't fixed this typo here, but we have a male and a female of the same species. So we're not exactly sure what species of longhorn bee this is, but we've narrowed it down to the Melisodes genus. But the males here are the ones that give them the common name. So they have these incredibly long and articulate antennae that they use to sense females or to find females. The females are usually a little bit more robust. They're rotund and fertile, and they have these large scopia on the backs of their legs that gather pollen that they'll end up feeding to their young. And in general, they'll have more pronounced or more developed mandibles at the front of their faces and shorter antennae. Okay, mining bees are another great group of solitary ground nesting bees. Some of the more common ones are like this prunus mining bee here. They are generally really small, and they'll have kind of mottled hairs or scopi on their thorax and on their faces. Sometimes they'll have light scopi on their back legs as well. And there are many, many species of mining bee. There are many, many species of longhorn bee. Then there are many, many species of sweat bee. And so sweat bees are also solitary and ground nesting. The most beautiful ones to come across are definitely the green metallic sweat bees. Those are in the genus Agapostemon, and they're usually a little bit easier to identify because they have that kind of metallic, shiny green coloration either on their thorax or their abdomen, or sometimes both. In this case, you have the bright green thorax and then the yellow and black striped abdomen. And then in this case, you have the full green coloration. But mining bees can usually be identified by their scopi, and so that'll be pronounced hairs on their back legs. And then you have other sweat bees in the genus Halictus. They aren't the green metallic kind. Generally, they will have some striping on the backs of their abdomens, but they have those scopi. And there are so many species, it can be really difficult to site identify them, but there are some tricks to narrowing it down that I'll get into later. And then here we have a cuckoo bee. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them, but they're pretty interesting bee species. They don't have some of the same characteristics as other bees do because they've developed a strategy that is kleptoparasitic. And so they actually sneak into other solitary bee nests, lay their eggs on the provisions that were left for the true offspring of that nest. And then they'll generally outcompete the bees that live there. So they were named after cuckoo birds that show the same kind of brood parasitic behavior. And as a result, they're generally a little bit more bald. They don't have scopi the same way that bees do that require carrying lots of pollen to bring back to feed their young. And so they can kind of throw you for a loop sometimes. So I just thought I'd throw those in there. And they tend to be in the genus Nomada. Okay, other solitary bees will not actually nest in the ground, and they'll nest in abandoned tunnels or holes that are up off of the ground. So in the wild or in nature, that would be in old woodpecker holes or holes that have been bored by beetles, maybe in fallen reeds like lake reeds or bamboo in other parts of the world. But we have made some salient observations about their nesting preferences. We know kind of the size and diameter and shape of the tubes or the holes that they require to nest in. And that's made it easy for us to provide habitat for them and to actually rear these solitary bees in a way that isn't quite as easily done for bees that nest in the ground. And so the main groups of solitary tunnel nesting bees that we have here in the Pacific Northwest are going to be mason bees. And inside of these tunnels, they'll nest in a similar manner to the ones in the ground, but rather than having chambers that come off of a main tunnel, they'll have just that one straight shot down, and then they'll separate each little chamber with a developing baby in it by some kind of nesting material. So with mason bees, that'll be mud. They'll build mud walls like masons. And here you can see these are all cocoons or pupating bees in their individual chambers separated by those mud walls. The other group that's most common here is going to be the leaf-cutting bee. And so they're active in the summertime while mason bees are active in the spring. But these leaf cutters nest in the same strategy. They require smaller holes than mason bees. They're a little bit smaller and daintier in body. And the nesting materials that they use are actually leaf and petal cutouts rather than something like mud. And so they'll chew these little perfect semicircular pieces of leaves, soft leaves or soft petals off of plants, carry them back to the nest, and then line the chambers with those to separate the developing bees. Okay, so the common solitary tunnel nesting bees we have here, I'll start with the blue orchard mason bee. Here we have a male and a female side by side. The males are only active for a very short window at the beginning of the year, or at the beginning of their season. And then the females are the ones that take care of all of the work for the rest of the season. But the male here is executing his one job, which is to mate. And they have longer antennae, kind of smaller bodies, and then a lot more fuzz on their faces. Whereas females are larger in body. They have those pronounced mandibles at the front that helps them collect mud or form little mud balls that they can bring back to the nest. And they have larger scopy or pollen collecting hairs on their abdomens. Okay, so beyond mason bees, there are some other common species that you'll see here. The blue orchard mason bee, or Osmia lignaria, is native to the Pacific Northwest, but over time and with introduction, there have been other common species pop up, and ones that you really can't avoid having. And so that would be like Osmia cornifrons, the horn-faced mason bee, which is actually an Asian species of mason bee. I believe they were introduced for blueberry pollination and have just kind of spread from there. But there are many, many, many species of Osmia that are native to the Pacific Northwest. Their abundance is generally a little bit less than some of these other species I've talked about, but it can be really challenging to identify them. They're notoriously difficult. And actually, one way you can know that a bee is Osmia or a mason bee, they have kind of a third toe on their front tarsal, and that's often used in identifying them. But even then, still getting to species ID is very difficult, and it's generally used when they collect males, get them under a dissecting scope, and extend their genitals in order to get a species ID, which is not something that's incredibly practical for site IDs or for field studies or for field work for hobbyists like us. But if we move a little bit later into the season, the solitary tunnel nesting bees that we'll predominantly see will be alfalfa leaf-cutting bees, western leaf-cutting bees, and then other leaf-cutting bees that might be around. And there are many species of those as well. And their relative abundance in the area is quite different depending on the species. But leaf-cutting bees are easily identified by having these really long scopa on their the undersides of their abdomens. And often when found and sighted in the field, they'll already have kind of that Velcro pad completely covered in pollen, like this alfalfa leaf-cutting bee here. So if you see that great bright yellow belly, that's kind of a good cue that you're looking at a leaf-cutting bee. And then wool carder bees are also very closely related. So all of these solitary tunnel nesting bees are in the same family, and that is Megachilidae. And so they are megachilid. They were introduced from Europe, but they nest in a similar strategy and do provide important pollination services as well. But their nesting materials are a little bit more unique. They scrape fuzzy materials off of plants like lamb's ear or tobacco leaves and use that to line their nest chambers. They often get mistaken for yellow jackets because they do kind of have that same yellow jacket color patterning on their bodies, but they're a little bit more robust, rotund, larger in size, thicker, fatter, and somewhat shorter, and they'll have more hair on their bodies. Okay. And then, of course, we have kind of our unknown megachilids. They're usually the trick to knowing that they're in that family, even is just by where they're carrying pollen. So the scopa here, you can kind of see the pollen on the underside of that belly. We didn't get a great shot of any other of her features, and so getting a species identification is particularly challenging in some cases like this. Okay, so we've talked a lot about pollination, but I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And so a pollinator is any animal that transfers pollen from the male anther, the male part of the flower, to a flower of the same species that comes in contact with the female stigma. And so that pollen is essentially the male genetic material of the plant itself, and when it comes in contact with the stigma of the same species, that pollen will travel down the ovule into the ovary to fertilize the egg, and that's how they produce seed. And so seed is kind of the embryo of the plant, and that is helpful for reseeding a lot of flowering plants that are native to this ecosystem, but it's also important for producing fruit. And so like a cherry, the seed inside of that has been fertilized, and that's the embryo, and it produces the fruit around it as kind of that nutrient-rich method or incentive for seed dispersal from things like birds. And so in order to actually produce the fruit or the food at all, the seed needs to be fertilized. And many times, and in many cases, that requires an animal pollinator to move that pollen around. Okay. Bees are particularly suited to this task based on how they gather their food and the means by which they are, or the reason that they're visiting flowers. And so they've developed all of those hairs and those important morphological characteristics for carrying pollen around. But that means when they're flying from flower to flower, when they're landing, they're dropping a lot of that and moving a lot of that around specifically. And depending on the bee species, they may be better suited to the task than others. And so when we're talking about some of the more primitive bees or bees that evolved earlier on, they generally have a higher effective pollination rate because of the placement of their scopa. And so the scopa of like a leafcutter bee is on the abdomen here. This is a small carpenter bee, the Caratina. They have scopa in between their abdomen and thorax here. And so they drop a lot more. And so about 95 out of every 100 flowers is effectively pollinated to produce a seed, and in some cases fruit. And then when we talk about more sophisticated bees or bees in the family Apidae, they generally have specialized structures on their back legs or specialized scopae or corbiculae that require them to groom the pollen off their bodies and kind of stuff it into these little baskets or these little satchels on their back legs. As a result, they have less apparent pollen on their hairs or on their bodies that may come in contact with the stigma of the next flower. So as a result, they're only pollinating about every 5 out of 100 plants that or flowers that they're landing on. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're worse pollinators, but they do have a lower effective pollination rate. In many cases, these bees are visiting many more flowers. They can visit more flowers and carry more pollen at a time than the more primitive bees. And often they have much longer active windows during the year. So bumblebees and honeybees are active for pretty much the entire warm season. So they're visiting a greater variety of plants and providing pollination over a greater time window, while solitary bees that are only active for a short time window, who are maybe having a higher effective pollination rate, aren't visiting the same quantity and amount of flowers as these bees are. So really what I'm trying to get across here is that no one bee species is more important than the other, and actually increasing diversity and having many, many types of bees in our ecosystems is going to be the most important for driving effective pollination of the variety of native plants that we have in our ecosystems. Okay, but it's not only bees that are pollinators. So a pollinator we defined earlier is any animal that is visiting a flower and transferring pollen from one flower to another. And wasps were actually some of the first animals that did this. They're not specifically gathering pollen as food for themselves. And so generally they're not kind of grabbing up quite as much when they land on a flower, but they do nectar feed, and in the process of nectar feeding, they have these kind of long proboscises, just like honeybees and other pollinating insects. And those tongues, as they sip nectar, get pollen on them, which can be transferred when they're gathering nectar from the next flower. Generally, their protein source is going to be from hunted insects or cleaning up rotting carcasses. But generally it's going to be a meaty protein source that they have. They're carnivorous, where bees are florivores. And there are many, many, many different types of wasps. There are wasp species in every niche, every habitat niche, taking advantage of different resources. They're actually there are more animals in the wasp group than any other group of animals in the world. And so there are more species of wasp than any other group. And they have very diverse morphological characteristics. They look a lot different, and they have very diverse behaviors, habitat niches that they occupy. And this one here, so this is a tiny parasitic wasp. Usually parasitic wasps or parasitoids can be identified by their size as being small, but then they have these long ovipositors at the back that they use to inject eggs into, a soft-bodied caterpillar or larvae somewhere, or into a solitary bee's nest, and their offspring, or the eggs that they lay, will take advantage of the food that the mother has laid them on. Okay. And within that group, so I wanted to talk quickly about yellow jackets and European paper wasps. These ones are kind of viewed as pests, and they often get confused for one another when site identified, because they look incredibly similar. But yellow jackets can be identified from, or can be differentiated from, European paper wasps by having black antennae, whereas European paper wasps have orange antennae. And they have different nesting strategies. So female yellow jackets, the queens, will burrow underground. They'll find, usually an abandoned rodent den or some other hollow cavity to take advantage of underground. And then they'll start building these elaborate and large paper nests where they'll be developing their young. They're usually quite a large colony, but they are seasonal. And so by the end of the season, they'll raise many virgin queens that will go out, mate, and then hibernate through the winter to come out in the spring to start the process over again. And so at the end of the season, usually when yellow jackets are the most pesky or pest-like or have most pest behaviors is going to be at the end of their season when they have many individuals and there's less food in the environment, and it's kind of their more desperate time of the year because they're coming to an end. And so that'll be, you know, August, September, and if it's warm in October, you may have many yellow jackets that are coming around to land it on meat or on any fruit or sugary substances you have outside during a barbecue. They'll find cat food. I mean, they just get really desperate, and that's usually when they're more of a problem for people in their yards. So if you do have yellow jackets in your area, really the most effective way to get rid of them or to cut them off is to catch and put up traps for the queens in the spring before the queens have a chance to nest. If you weren't able to apprehend them during that stage and you do have an established yellow jacket nest in your yard and you've found the entrance and they're coming and going from a place that's relatively easy for you to access, we don't recommend using pesticides to kill them because those pesticides and chemical methods of getting rid of them do also affect bees and other beneficial insects that you have around. So our favorite method for actually getting rid of a yellow jacket nest is to put a clear glass or a clear bowl over the entrance. The light will come in, the worker bees will still try to get out of that nest, but they'll be trapped inside, and it takes a matter of a few days in order to kill all of them inside of the nest. If you were to use an opaque bowl or something that didn't have light come through it, they would dig another tunnel out and use that as their entrance. Apparently they're not smart enough to figure out that there's a barrier that's clear and to dig another entrance, but we can take advantage of that to suppress their populations when they become extra pesky. Paper wasps, however, usually live in very small colonies. They'll build these cup-like kind of paper nests that will hang underneath awnings, and sometimes you'll see them in mason bee houses or in beehives. They generally do not really have or pose a problem or aren't really exhibiting much pest behavior, at least for humans. And they do eat and hunt insects that are garden pests. And so they could be considered beneficial insects to have, and it's something that I wouldn't worry too much about. They're very non-defensive. We have some of these nesting in, open spaces in our mason bee houses, and we can get up close to them, and they might kind of shimmer a little bit or shiver or shake, and that is their defensive behavior. But we've never had one come at us or attack us or sting us or anything like that, even though we've been really up close to them. We've even knocked nests down and have had no defensive response. And so these ones I really wouldn't worry too much about in your area. All right, so flies are also an important group of pollinators for us to consider. And flies are also incredibly diverse, and some are nectar feeders while some are not. So some are pollinators and some are not. But often there are many different species of fly that are bee mimics. And so these would be things like syrphid flies or the bombyliad here, where they're mimicking the morphology, or they're looking like a stinging insect while they are not. But they are important nectar feeders that do pollinate. And many of those syrphid flies will actually have free-living larvae as they're young that will be, the eggs will be laid on plants and on food crops, and then the larvae will eat garden pests, and they are predatory. And so they're very beneficial as biocontrol for pests in gardens, but then also to pollinate native plants by nectar feeding. Okay, so telling the difference between bees, wasps, and bee mimicking flies can be a little bit tricky, but there are some general tips and things to look for when you're site identifying. And I'm not going to go through every point in this table, but you'll have access to it to kind of help you troubleshoot or make certain identifications as you're going. Okay, so butterflies are also pollinators, and they're very charismatic and people often really love them. We have the western swallowtail here, but you can usually tell the difference between a butterfly and a moth by their antennae. So butterflies have these little barbels at the tips of their antennae, whereas moths, and particularly male moths, have kind of these brachiated branching antennae that they use to sense females. Butterflies in general are more active during the day, where moths are active at night, so they might be pollinating night blooming flowers and night blooming plants. But they all have these long tongues that curl up at the front. That's called a proboscis. They unravel them, and usually when they're feeding, they're hovering. So they're feeding mid-flight and are getting pollen grains on their long tongues that will be transferred to the next flower that they visit. Okay, so butterflies and moths all have these kind of free-roaming larvae or caterpillars, as you may be more familiar with them. And so when supporting butterflies, it is important to have blooming plants that they can nectar feed from, but then also having host plants that their larvae can eat. And so these host plants are where the females will lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch and the caterpillars will eat the leafy material of the plant to grow. And once they're at their full size, they'll spin a cocoon and pupate in the field and then emerge as a butterfly when their complete metamorphosis has been completed. Often caterpillars have to come up with different defense mechanisms. They can't fly away. They're kind of just this big fatty snack that's apparent and easy for things like birds and other predators to find and access. And so some of them have developed the ability to eat poisonous plants and metabolize that for their own use so that they are poisonous to eat. And then they might have spiky, hairs or soft fuzz on their bodies that sheds and becomes irritating to whoever's handling them. And so all of those things are important to consider when you're interacting with caterpillars or trying to support them by providing host plants. Beetles, I'm not going to talk too much about. So that's all in the order Coleoptera. And again, it's another hugely diverse group of insects that inhabit and play a role in every niche in our environments and in our ecosystems. But some of them are pollinators as well, just by virtue of being on flowers for other behaviors. So sometimes you might have a beetle that's waiting for another visiting insect to come by to eat, and then they may transfer pollen if they're visiting another flower to ambush different prey. Ladybugs sometimes can be found on flowers, but usually that's as a byproduct of them laying eggs somewhere. And we're all pretty used to thinking of ladybugs as, charismatic beetles or individual insects in our ecosystems, but their larvae are also biocontrol agents that consume garden pests like aphids. Okay, but really any beetle or any animal that's visiting a flower has the potential to be a pollinator. And that includes vertebrates. So this frog, we have lots of frogs out at Willowpar, and they often seek refuge in flowers. And if they're hopping from flower to flower, there may be some pollen transfer that happens. Doesn't strictly mean that they are pollinators or they aren't like the largely used pollinator by that plant, but it can happen sometimes. But then hummingbirds, they are exclusively nectar feeders to fuel their really intensive flight as adults. And then they gather insects as the protein source to feed their young back at their nest. But generally, they'll use their really long beak, and they kind of have a tongue that sticks out of that long beak, and they'll gather nectar from flowers that have very long nectar tubes at the back. And generally they prefer those bright red flowers with long nectar tubes. If you are someone who enjoys having hummingbirds in your area and puts up hummingbird feeders, I would encourage you to look into planting hummingbird plants instead. Often you'll have other bees or other insects coming to that feeder as well. And it's just an inferior food source to nectar for their health and for hummingbirds too. So if you can seek out hummingbird plants instead of feeders, that is something I would encourage. Okay, so now we're going to dive more into observing and interacting with insects yourselves. We kind of had that primer of what you might see, but as far as being successful in these interactions, there are a couple of tips and tricks that I have that I'd like to share. So most of the time, if you see me out in the world, or if I'm taking a walk and I've stopped and I'm looking down at a plant, usually it's because I'm waiting for something to come by, and I'm just waiting patiently to see who's going to visit, or maybe I've already spotted something out of the corner of my eye and it's been drawn down unexpectedly. But it's kind of like fishing in the sense it's very meditative. So if you pick a plant that's in a nice sunny spot, eventually you're going to have some insect visitors that come by. And what I would do is, if you know the plant species, I would make a note of that. If you don't know the species, maybe you can describe the type of plant it is, so if it's a shrub or if it's, kind of like a cover crop of lots of blooming wildflowers. If it's a weed, you might note that down. Or the characteristics of the flower, like it has long, radial shaped yellow petals with a big corolla center, black center. But really, you're just going to want to get comfortable and then start making notes. So some things that I like to note, and some things that ecologists measure when they're doing observations like this, would be things like species richness. So how many different types of visitors or visiting insects do you notice on the plant? Or species abundance. So how many individuals within those distinct notice. So we have lots of catmint out at the farm. It provides a really great food source for honeybees, and every time I look at it, it is completely covered in honeybees, but generally I'm hard pressed to see anything else there. And so that plant is really supporting an abundance of that one species, but not so much richness of different species. And then the things that I like to note are behavioral patterns that I'm noticing. So whether the insects are gathering pollen, so if they're, getting pollen on their faces and they're moving it to their scopae with their front legs, or if they're grooming pollen and stuffing it into satchels on their back legs, or pollen pants, we like to call those. Whether they're gathering nesting material. So if I see a leafcutter bee kind of chewing circles out of leaves, I'll note that down. Maybe I'm seeing insects that are eating the plant matter, so like a caterpillar that's on the plant. Or maybe they're just kind of sunning and bobbing their abdomens. Bees require a pretty warm environment in order to fly, and sometimes they have to generate their own heat. If it gets cloudy, they may find a good spot on a flower and just kind of wiggle until they're warm enough to fly away. And that's something that I would note down. Otherwise, other observations or things that you could note would be morphological characteristics, color of the bee, where you see their scopa, whether they have long antennae or short antennae, big mandibles. Really, sky's the limit there. Whatever you notice and whatever you observe is valid, and it's important to put down. You can take pictures, you can illustrate your notes, and then kind of as a final stage, you can collect your insects. For hobbyist appreciation, generally we recommend doing something called a catch and release. So using a net to secure your insect, getting them in a vial and observing them for a short time in that enclosed space. That usually is very helpful for making morphological notes and other observations like that. And then releasing them so they can go back to their nest or to whatever they were doing. And I have a short video to share with you on the process of doing that. And so we'll watch that now.
Today, we're going to talk about how to get up close and personal with the bees and pollinators or other insects that you have living in your neighborhood, maybe in your backyard. Hi, my name is Becca. I'm with Bee and Bloom, and we're here at our home base, Willow Bar Farm on Sauvie Island, just outside of Portland. We've found that the best way to form those relationships and to make observations and get closer to these insects is to do catch and release. And there are two main tools that we use for catch and release. The first one is your standard butterfly net. So this is a mesh net. It's not super heavy duty, and later when I do a demonstration you'll hear me refer to this side of the net or this little piece as the toe. And then once you actually get your insect in the net, your next tool or the next piece that you'll need is some kind of collection vial. We use these standard snap top plastic vials. You'll be able to secure your insect in this container and then pop the lid on very quickly to observe them, and then once you're done looking at them for a short time, you'll be able to open it to release them very easily. You can really use any kind of collection vessel. So you could use a screw top jar, like a mason jar, or anything that's clear glass that you'd be able to see through. Okay, I'm out in the field and I've picked myself a good plant that I know bees, and in particular bumblebees, really like. And here I have spotted actually a yellow-faced bumblebee. Essentially what you're going to do, and what I've found is the best when working with foraging bees or ones that are on plants already, is just to very lightly put the net around the plant as they're foraging and then wait for them to be done. And once this bumblebee is done gathering nectar or pollen or whatever she's getting off of this plant, she'll move up. So she's going to move higher, and I want to get her in the toe of this net. Here she's moving higher and higher. There we go. Insects always move up, and that's a pretty good rule of thumb when you're collecting. So she's in the net now, and I'm just going to fold it over the side so that she can't get out. And I'm going to place it down, grab my vial, and just place it at that toe with the bee there in the vial. And then I've got my lid, and I'm just going to slide it into the top. She kind of fell to the bottom, and that was kind of a good moment just to slide my lid back in. Really, just take your time, be really patient. I know this can be a little bit nerve-wracking, especially when working with stinging insects. So if you wanted to start working on something like flies, just for some practice, or beetles or other non-stinging insects, they all kind of behave that same way, wanting to go to the top or the toe of that net. Here I have my little lady worker, yellow-faced bumblebee. These are very, very common in the Portland metro area, so I'm sure you'll be having maybe this exact same encounter. And you may notice she's kind of going up against the walls. She maybe looks a little bit concerned. Some people might think she looks a little angry, but really all she's doing is looking for a way out. She just wants to go back to the flowers. She wants to go back to doing her job, to being a bee. And so really once you release them, they're not going to come after you. They'll leave you alone, which I will demonstrate right now. So I like to point it away from myself still. And it's kind of just the way to do it. And then we will open it up, and there she goes. So here we are at some yarrow, and this is a perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate a sweep. Flies love this stuff, and it's going to be a lot of beneficial flies, some whose larvae are predatory on garden and farm pests. All right, I'm going to sweep the net, sweep, and hopefully I got it. I did! All right, so I swept it, covered it, and now I've got my little syrphid fly friend moving up toward that toe, and I'm gonna get her in my vial. And I've got my vial pressed up against the toe where that fly was, and there we go. Syrphid flies are super cool. They have this kind of pancaked body that folds down over the side. Great big eyes, little antennae, but then they also often have yellow and black striping on their abdomens. They're little bee mimics, so that any predator that might have learned to avoid bees for their sting based on their color patterning would also avoid these syrphid flies. Remember when Pokemon Go was really popular? This is way cooler.
Okay, so now that you are all experts in catch and release, there are some important tools and sources for gathering them. So we get most of our materials from BioQuip. It's a science supply, a science tools supplier. They're really the most widely used supplier for these. And if you go to their website, it's like an old school 90s catalog on the website itself, and it can be kind of hard to navigate. And so I've linked out specific areas that you can visit for those different tools. Regarding insect nets, the ones that I would recommend purchasing are the aerial nets or classic butterfly nets. They're a little bit more gauzy and they have a less heavy weave so that you can see through them more easily as you're collecting your insects. But they also aren't incredibly heavy duty. So if you are going to be sweeping your nets through brush or through brambles, you'll need something that's a little bit more heavy and so that it doesn't become damaged. And those would be termed sweep nets. And generally, I only recommend using those for large scale collections, and usually through brush or in areas where you wouldn't expect to have stinging insects, because you're kind of flying blind as you're going in to put your vial in. Another supplier that is great to use and generally is a little bit geared towards kids is Home Science Tools. They have like insect collection kits that you can get, but they also have other great science kits like chemistry sets and rock polishing kits and things like that that are available here. Amazon apparently has everything, and so you can get some things through Amazon as well. But I really recommend going through BioQuip if you can. And then regarding vials, here's a link out to kind of the catalog section for the insect collecting vials that they have available. And then the 8940 code is the sizing that we recommend for beginners. It's a little bit larger and easier to manipulate, and they have those easy snap-on lids. If you're looking for something with a magnifying lid, Home Science Tools has one, and then they're also pretty widely available on Amazon. Okay, so as far as identifying insects, there are some steps that you can take in order to get to kind of narrow it down. Using a dichotomous key is really the only way to separate individuals out. And so it might be, oh, wings are covered by an exoskeleton, so I'm looking at beetles. This beetle has long antennae, so I'm going to move down toward the group of beetles that have long antennae, and you just kind of get more and more specific from there. Bug Guide is a really great online dichotomous key that has pictures. They also have forums where you can post pictures and ask the community what they think you have, especially if you've narrowed it down a little bit, even if you're like, I know it's a bee, but I'm not sure what kind. There will be people that can help you kind of narrow it down a little bit. As far as site IDing in the field, you'll really have that group of common insects that you see a lot that you'll be able to identify right away. But then taking pictures can help with identifying later. And then what I recommend as far as identifying, I would begin with trying to identify insects to order. And so bees, wasps, and ants are all in the same order. That's Hymenoptera, beetles are Coleoptera, flies are Diptera, and there are many others, but they're common ones. And generally that's pretty easy to do and is pretty rewarding to do in the field. And then you can advance to family as you become more and more confident and begin to notice, like family is easier. So if you know that you're seeing a bumblebee, then that would be easier to identify to family, and even a genus. You have Bombus, and that can be pretty rewarding. Or if you're, seeing a group of, or if you have a sweat bee, or you have a solitary tunnel nesting bee, sometimes observing their behaviors will help you kind of identify them to family that way. So like all of those solitary tunnel nesting bees that live in those habitats we talked about are going to be in the same family, Megachilidae. And you're just going to get better and better at that as you go. And really the only way to advance is to practice and to use dichotomous keys and, start working through narrowing it down. And the best way to do that is to either collect or take a picture, make it really important or really specific notes about what you're seeing, and then use those resources at your own pace later. You can also send specimens to entomology labs. So Oregon State University has an insect clinic, and this is a link to there. They have instructions on how to submit samples, and they can send your specimen back with an identification, which is really cool. I already talked about posting images on forums, but if you're getting really into this and you're starting your own insect collections and you're getting closer to species identification, something you might want to invest in is a dissecting microscope. It's a pretty advanced practice, but it's incredibly rewarding and fun to do to get that microscope and really start noticing all of the tiny differences in morphological characteristics between bees, like the size of their cheek or whether they have a third toe or anything like that. Okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about insect collections. I think for the purposes of today's presentation and the goal of interacting with and forming a relationship with the bees and insects you have in your yard, collections don't really apply. But if you're becoming more involved in species identifications, or you want to have a display of something that you've been working on, or if you're participating in citizen science initiatives that require your specimens to be present, this is something that you'll want to look into. And there are generally some tools for this. You'd have to collect your insect, freeze it in order to kill it, and then rehydrate them so that you can mold their body parts into place. So some characteristics or some things that really need to be shown or present in insect collections might be legs extended so that they can be looked at under a microscope to identify them. Collections are really useful for science. And even at a hobbyist level, they don't really there is no measurable impact, or there's no evidence of a measurable impact on insect populations from doing collections. And there have been several studies that look into this. Insects tend to be very robust and have lots of populations, and actually being able to track and know what's here at different times and look at how that's changing over years and over many years is very valuable information to us in order to protect them over a longer term. There are some institutions like the Bohart Museum of Entomology at UC Davis and the University of Arizona Insect Collection. They go back decades, and having that information available to us and being able to look at the differences and compare things over a longer period of time is incredibly vital to doing conservation. Okay. So on a similar note, so Oregon Bee Project is a great citizen science project that was started out of Oregon State University and Oregon State Extension. So they have a citizen science project where people are collecting large samples of bees from their own yards and from their own habitats. They're preserving them. They've been trained in how to pin and sort insects down usually to family. And then they send their collections to Oregon State to be preserved, but then also identified by taxonomists and by experts. They're working on a large-scale map of Oregon and the different bees that we've had here. Since they've started, the estimated number of bee species that we have in Oregon has changed from about 300 to 500. And so it's been incredibly valuable information gleaned just from citizen science initiatives. And they've compiled an incredible list of resources for people. Those resources can range from what to plant in order to support pollinators, or how to put up solitary bee habitats, or how to minimize risk to bees if you have to apply pesticides, or how to landscape in a way that is helpful for bee habitat. It's a huge resource that I highly recommend looking into if this is a topic that you're interested in. Okay. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time at the end here talking about the different steps and things that we recommend people do to promote bees and to promote bee diversity in suburban and urban landscapes. And so we've kind of termed these the P's for pollinators. And so the very first thing and the most important thing we can do for bees and pollinators is to plant native blooming plants that have staggered bloom cycles. So they bloom at different times of the year, so that you have blooms during the entire warm season that supports bees that are active at different times. You can provide nesting sites. I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like specifically in a minute. Pitch pesticides out, purchase local or organic, or provide incentive and increased demand for farmers and for food producers to have bee-friendly practices, and to kind of engage in that discussion a little bit more with people who have a larger impact. And preaching stewardship, so getting other people excited about this as well. That could be sharing pictures of the insects or the bees that you see on social media. It could be doing collections and doing your observations, or playing bingo with friends or family members and neighbors. It's also kind of a teachable moment. If you have, dandelions or a lot of flowering plants in your lawn that maybe don't fit into the mold of what an attractive suburban housing situation might look like. You can, if you have complaints from a neighbor about dandelions, you could say, I'm just doing my part to save the bees, and kind of start that conversation and reshape what our idea of having a beautiful lived-in space looks like. Okay, so as far as the pollinator seed mix that we use, it's one that we've created that is specific to our environment out at Willow Bar Farm. And so we're trying to revamp kind of a dry, previously flooded area that has lots of sand into the meadowscape that it originally was. And so we've come up with a mix of annuals, long-lived perennials, and short-lived perennials that will provide blooms both in the short term and the long term, and will eventually be able to thrive without watering or too much intervention. And they bloom at different stages of the year. We've tried our hardest to have completely native mixes, but we also have some poppies mixed in that aren't on this list, or bachelor buttons, or things that provide blooms right away that are pretty prolific. And aren't necessarily native, but can provide a really good and important nectar source. Another resource that's really awesome for coming up with a seed mix or what plants to put in, the Xerces Society, that's Xerces, and that's xerces.org is their website. They have resources including regionally specific plant lists that have lists of native plants that bloom at different times, and they also list out who you might expect to see on those plants at different times of year, which is kind of cool and interesting. So I highly recommend checking that out as a resource as well. Okay, so providing nesting sites, I've talked a little bit about those solitary tunnel nesting bees like leaf cutters and mason bees. With Tualatin, we've been able to put on 2 webinars about working with those 2 specific groups of bees that are available to you all, and I'd highly recommend checking that out. But essentially, you'll put up a habitat structure that has holes or tubes that you can remove to clean and manage. They're very easy to work with. Solitary bees are very non-aggressive, and they provide really important and essential pollination services. It's a very rewarding experience. I recommend checking it out. You may provide areas that are a little bit more natural looking. So like bumblebees really like nesting in brambles and in brush piles in areas that are a little bit more concealed where they can burrow underneath and nest underneath them. And this is a great example of both using that provide and preach peas. So, a neighbor or someone else walking by might say, oh, that is horrible. They need to clear that out of here. What an eyesore. But then they might see this sign that says it's a native bee nest site, and it could completely shift their perception of what they're looking at. But then also having bare ground with good drainage and sun that you don't walk on much is also really beneficial for solitary tunnel nesting bees. Okay. And I would love to provide you all with some activities and resources to move forward with this on your own. So these are the webinars for working with both mason and leafcutter bees. These are links to the YouTube recordings of those webinars. Here are some really, really great books if you're interested in kind of diving a little bit deeper. This was the inspiration for today's webinar, The Bees in Your Backyard. It's a really comprehensive guide. So Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll work out of Utah, and so the bees that they see are going to be a little bit different from the bees that we see here. There are actually a lot more bees that live down there than up here, but this is an incredible resource and amazing pictures of bees to go through. And all of these are just really great reads. Attracting native pollinators is going to be a little bit more geared toward actionable conservation, whereas the bees that are more about the books that are more about appreciation are going to be things like The Forgotten Pollinators and Buzz and The Little Book of Bees and Our Native Bees, and they're all incredible. And so if you have some time on your hands now for reading, like I might imagine you will, check these out. They're super awesome. All right, and then we've put together a couple of activities for you to use as well. So at Pollinator Bingo, these are both links out, but also on the webpage at the end of this, I'll have a completely compiled list of resources for you to go through. So Pollinator Bingo is super fun. So there are things on there like, oh, I saw a bee with pollen pants, or I saw a green metallic sweat bee. All of those items are really fun to kind of go through and observe. And then we have a guided field notes activity for you to go through as well. Okay, and then this here is that website where you can access today's presentation and then all of the resources that I talked about throughout the presentation. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebekah. That was great.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us for this Bees in Your Backyard webinar. And just to point you again, in the description of this YouTube video, you'll find that link to the website that Rebekah had just put up, which will have some additional resources for you. We'll both have our contact information in that description as well in case you have any questions, and the evaluation survey is down there as well if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to help us develop these programs a little bit more. Great. Well, thank you again for joining us, and we will hopefully see you next time.
Thanks.